Well, in my second year at Cambridge, which is a long time ago now, I was at the time doing economics, but in those days it included sociology and politics. And within the sociology, political sociology, and within the political sociology, there was some very interesting talks on identity. And in the course of those lectures, somebody mentioned and suggested we read a person who at that time was relatively unknown, whose name was Ronald Lang. And so we read at that time the Politics of Experience, and then at the same time, once we got interested in it, the Divided Self and the Self and Others. And this, interesting enough, was the way I got interested in psychoanalysis. And then soon, along with a couple of friends of mine, we also started reading Freud and Racker and things of this kind. Well, at the end of that was the second year, I thought by then that I wanted to be a psychoanalyst, or at least I was interested in it. I didn't understand at all that it wasn't a sort of postgraduate thing that you did next and had to go, wait for 10 years or something, as many people think now. I just simply contacted the Institute and went and had a very nice talk with Enid Barlint in her house in 7 Park Square West. The interesting thing was she treated me with complete respect, did not give me at all to realize that I was a bit, precocious in this thing, and kind of said, come back next year when you've got your degree. And a friend of mine who was a Cambridge lecturer who I played tennis with suggested that there was a new course in medical sociology at Bedford College, which was just starting because the Royal Commission on Medical Education had asked that doctors be better trained in the social and psychological aspects of their work. So I went to this master's course, and this was taught by George Brown and Margot Jeffries, and I got to know George Brown, who's subsequently become extremely well known for his work on the etiology of depression, and did that master's course. But all the time my analysis was going on, and I then applied and started the analytic training, whilst at the same time I was still at Bedford College and involved in the research work that George was doing. But what was interesting about that research is that the problem that they had to deal with was how do you decide whether life events cause a depression or anything else, because if you take into account the subjective response of the respondent, you could get in trouble. There is an explanation for it in the work of a classic Cambridge psychologist, Frank, I think it is, Bartlett, who developed the concept of effort after meaning, which is roughly speaking that if something has happened to you that you need to explain, then you have a much better memory, or even subtly change the various things that you remember from the past. So George was concerned, how do we get over that problem methodologically in depression, and whilst at the same time retaining some notion of subjectivity. And I think it was a brilliant solution that he came up with, which was they decided that people would be asked about a range of events, pre-decided, all kinds of things, which everyone would be asked about those things, so it wouldn't be a test of effort after meaning, but subjectivity was introduced, because when we were doing these interviews or rating them afterwards, and while you had to judge, would an average person sitting on the Clapham omnibus, George used to come in by bus, what effect would this particular thing have on them? So this took account of subjectivity in the sense it's, what kind of thing would someone be expected? How would they be expected to respond to this, but managed to avoid the potential for bias. Anyway, it turned out to be highly successful because, as you probably know, they were able eventually to show that whereas it was not true with people who had a schizophrenic diagnosis, for people with a depressive diagnosis, they had many more of these life events than a control group of Camberwell women. And George went on to do this study in numerous other places, and also to show that actually there were various predisposing factors that increased or decreased the effect. For me, this was a fantastic training in research by, I think, one of the most gifted researchers that there ever has been, because he was completely interested in detail. The second bit of work I then went on to was when I was given a research unit to run in Cambridge, which was called the Health Education Studies Unit. And the first project, which I took immediate charge of, was a study of patients going to their GPs and what they understood of what the doctor told them. What we did there was we found 16 GPs within 100 miles of London, 8 of whom were supposed to be rather advanced GPs, 8 of whom were just GPs in the area nearby. And we recorded their consultations for like a certain number of surgeries in a week. We ended up with over 1,000 consultations, which were sound recorded. And then on a fairly random process, 400 of those consultations were selected. And we went to interview the patient almost within 2 or 3 days of them seeing the doctor. The interviewer knew nothing about the patient when they arrived. And we found some quite interesting things which have always been important to me. One was that at the time, the standard work in psychology suggested that people forgot most of what they were told by their doctor, which was not a very good result because it meant doctors felt there wasn't much point talking to patients. And that, to some extent, pleased doctors because they're under a lot of pressure and it kind of made their life easier. But it didn't seem quite right to me. So we looked at how they'd done this, and the way it had been done with questionnaires. People had been given a questionnaire, and I'm now not telling the details correctly, but the questionnaire, sort of asked how much do you remember of what you're doing, sort of thing. And this produced these results. What we did was when we got to people's houses, we went and saw them in their houses, which was quite a major effort. We went and sat them down, and I was always influenced not only by the work with George Brown, but also by watching really good old-fashioned detective stories on television. And you know what they do there? The good detective is very careful to avoid response sets. And so it doesn't say, did you see Mr. Brown walking up the street? Or did you see a man in a blue coat? They say, did you see anybody walking up the street on Wednesday? Well, just let's go back to where you were sitting at lunch, and it starts to get detailed. So what we did with the patients, we'd say, well, you were sitting in the waiting room, I suppose, when Dr. So-and-so called you. What happened next? And then you would deliberately interrupt them once or twice if they weren't going in real detail, and to say, oh, did he switch the light on? Or something like this, to indicate. Another person who does this very well is George Smiley, actually, in John le Carré's novels. So you get them talking in detail, and then with no effort, they will give you a blow-by-blow account of everything significant that happens in a consultation. So the previous result was just an artifact of the way we talk to people. We then developed quite an interesting thing in which we measured the recall, which was more or less 100%. But of course, the second issue is, well, do people understand what the doctor said in the sense the doctor made it? So we had a way of assessing that. And then the third one was, do people agree, in other words? Because this was when I formulated the idea, which is still part of my theories today, that patients go with their own models of explaining their illness. So consequently, we were interested in, did people having been treated by the doctor, did they get carried along with what the doctor said, and did they then take the pills or whatever, because there'd been a long-standing evidence of massive waste of health service money, with pills not being used, pills put in cupboards, pills taken by the wrong people, etc. Our finding was then that people remembered pretty well, they understood not too badly, so up to about 80%, and they even agreed most of the time. But we were then interested in where they didn't. And the fascinating finding was that people didn't agree with the doctor, mainly because they'd gone along with a different model than the doctor already had. So most communication is highly successful because doctor and patient already, if you like, knew the answers. Where there was a communication challenge, that's where it often didn't work. And we came with this anthropology idea of the explanatory model. Now, go forward a bit, and I'm using the concept of explanatory model in the comparative clinical methods groups as a way of trying to understand how do analysts work with their patient. Not how do they work in some deep unconscious way, although that might be important, but what is the kind of what are the kind of ideas that are implicit in how they think they need to do psychoanalysis. And in that, we in fact followed some of what I'd learned in the medical sociology, because we formulated, that analysts will implicitly have an idea of what's wrong with their patients and how their work is supposed to help them. They'll have an idea of how the patient's illness has come about and what's the kind of process for it. They'll have an idea of what they're supposed to do, and they'll have an idea which boils down to how they should listen, and of course they'll have an idea of what's going on between them, in other words, the transference. So this provided a relatively theory-free, of course there's no such thing, but a relatively theory-free way of looking at what analysts do with their patients without using terms like transference and projection and all these terms, the unconscious, which in fact people nowadays use with many, many elastic meanings attached. So, in my view, psychoanalysis, the potential for psychoanalysis has barely been exploited. Now, the reason I say psychoanalysis is nowhere near its potential is that I think if you take the fundamental discoveries of Freud, they have massive application into many areas of society. It's that you bring certain perspectives, certain ways of thinking, certain ways of understanding dynamics into the whole situation. So what I became interested in, as you probably know, was the whole business of watching what was happening in the dot-com bubble to finance. I'd kind of gone back a bit to the medical sociology or the work on doctors and patients, and now I would have the chance to bring in also my economics. So I began to get ideas about what was going on in financial markets, which do not need to be psychoanalyzed, but where you can see certain processes taking place. And what I've gradually realized is that the underlying common factor here is how people deal with uncertainty. And if you've got to make decisions which may involve loss, but also gain, then the whole question of how you manage uncertainty is very interesting, because there are no such thing as sure gains. And not many people, if any, except for people who have an illness, so to speak, go for sure losses. So the whole point is, how do people subjectively construct the situation? And one of the major limits of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology is they'd got on to what was called loss aversion very early on, very important concept. But it's one thing to talk about loss aversion, but you're not going to be averse to loss from an activity unless you actually think, in some sense, that you are likely to lose or may lose. So it's a subjective concept. So immediately you have perhaps the major developed value of psychoanalysis, is, at least as I see it, it's just about the only show in town when it comes to the rigorous examination of subjective point of view. There's an element of subjectivity in some Weberian or sociology, and of course in literature and other places, but the real study of it as such is in psychoanalysis. And you can then begin to understand how people respond to uncertainty. Actually, so that for instance, a great entrepreneur, take someone like Steve Jobs, right? There are lots of people who did the sort of thing that Steve Jobs did around. That is, they put everything into one activity. And most of those people got nothing because their idea wasn't very good, or it may be the idea was good, but the time wasn't right, etc. So, but what the world would not be as it is if people were able to do what the main economic and psychology theories say, that is, act rationally, which is a false label. Nothing rational about what they're talking about. It's merely that they mean you optimize over constraints and you optimize over a single value function, so there's no conflicts in values there. So uncertainty is a kind, and the way people deal with it is kind of crucial. Uncertainty is opportunity. But I remember a long meeting we had here at UCL when I started my centre, and we had about 25 professors from all over the university present, and I had to sort of put out this idea and get it approved. And two things happened at the end. One was that Gus O'Donnell, who used to run the Cabinet Office, kindly came along. He actually missed the debate in the House of Lords to do it. He said he'd been listening to all this, and now he realised that there wasn't really a significant decision they ever made in the cabinet that wasn't made under uncertainty. Now, Gus had been quite a straight economist, and so that was quite a major thing for him to say. Secondly, Peter Fonagy came in and said he'd been listening to all this, and what struck him was how interesting it was, since when working with patients, in his experience, the main problem was how to make them less certain. So that's quite, and of course that's capturing something very important. One of the dysfunctional ways people manage uncertainty is in fact to get rid of it by extreme certainty. You have to get rid of it or you'll be paralyzed. You have to get rid of it in some way. So the issue is, how do you deal with it? And I've just written a paper with the Dean of the School of Management at the Open University, in which we, for a management journal, in which we're proposing that really the whole way the management of businesses is looked at needs to be focused around this issue of how uncertainty is dealt with, rather than this absurd business of optimization, because nobody can optimize or know how to optimize if there is uncertainty. And this is also relevant to things like regulation. So if you'll create a new regulation, say in the finance market or the product market or safety regulation, then of course you can think what should it be and so on. But most regulations fail, and most regulations produce distortion. That's not a reason not to regulate, but it's a reason to recognize that in conditions of uncertainty, you can't know what the effects will be. So if you're going to do it well, when you make the regulation, you should also at the same time be building in ways to find out what its impact are. Now that of course requires another very important psychological attitude, which is the willingness to see bad news, the willingness to see your lovely regulation or idea doesn't seem to be working. And as we know, as psychoanalysts, that's painful, and people are inclined to look the other way. So how do we build systems? It's actually very challenging to look, both to be committed to what you're doing, because if you're not committed, nothing happens, but to be able to change and adapt, and not change too quickly, or you never make any proper decisions as well. I've seen it all around the world, the amount of energy put involuntarily mostly into training, but to not, in my view, nearly great enough effect. And all that goodwill, all that wanting to do it well, but it's not put inside a system of evaluation, of feedback and so on, which would actually lead to things being better. And of course, this refers to what Bion meant, I think, about a work group. Right? So a work, or the work aspect of a group, might be a better way of saying it, is where the group is focused on what it's meant to be doing. And if you're meant to be doing psychoanalytic education, then you should be all the time focused on what is the outcome of what we're doing, is what we're putting into it actually working, how can we do it better, and so on. Rather than the tendencies towards the basic assumption group. In various ways you become comfortable with each other or set up funny kinds of things. So the training is taking up enormous time, but it's not directed to the basic issue of what are our outcomes, or what do we think of them, how can we improve them, etc. That would be one. Similar in the area of research or journal publication. There is just a huge problem in psychoanalysis having agreed standards. Now, this is partly because there are, I think, different ways of doing psychoanalysis, and I mean equally successful. But if there are different, each one should be specified. For journal publication and for the scientific development of the discipline, that's another very interesting question. So there has actually been opposition to the idea that there should be judgment, that it, not sometimes even in the UK, the idea that really it's just an opinion, that there's no way of going beyond an individual opinion towards any kind of way of assessing the argument of the paper. Does the paper, do the arguments in the paper, support the thesis? And I've always taken, and that goes back to George Brown, in fact, a very broad view of research. That is to say, research for me is not about methods. It's about attitude of mind. It's about asking the question, does this evidence support the argument? And evidence is always measured, so it's always open to measurement error. So the question is the way you've chosen to measure, that indicates what you're looking at, is that any good? Now, none of these things have answers in abstract. The only way they can be assessed is when you and I start having a debate about something, and if we can have the imagination to think, well, what would decide that argument? What would decide it? What would we like to know that would help? And, the great scientists have been people who managed to think of something, or not all of the great scientists, but many of them, think of some way of setting a question you could actually answer. And so it's that attitude of setting the question. So, we could talk about Bion and his K, his curiosity, but it's having the capacity to answer, because some people take Bion and then make it that you can never answer anything, which I'm sure is not what he thought. So the scientific attitude is one of, can you find a way of convincing someone else that this argument has some value? And that's mainly done by trying to think of another argument against it and knocking it down. That's just the way it's an inadequate way of proceeding, but it's the best way to go. We need to be doing much more of that, and we need to be knocking out theories. We have far too many theories in psychoanalysis, many of which may be interesting, but interesting for what? And especially in the clinical situation, we have a funny situation of almost no real good theory about what actually is the way to proceed. We need something which works for psychoanalysis, which would have to be based on the fundamental principles of free association and evenly suspended attention, which are definitely not the principles of mentalization-based therapy or many of the other apply, because they can't be. They've got to be done in some time-limited framework. I'm not suggesting a manual, although I wouldn't oppose a manual. I mean, the question is, what is a manual? So if the manual leads, is just to read out the interpretation in the manual. But if there's a manual which says something like, on the whole, you shouldn't interpret to a patient until there's signs of an evident resistance, shall we say, then provided you've defined those terms and you've put it if on the whole, right, then this would be a sort of rule. And what I'd like to see is having some rules like that, and they may be just slightly different rules for different ways people want to work, so that you can then have a debate. Well, I didn't do that today because I don't think that was right. Fine. But what happens about on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and next Monday? You know, if you're, is it occasionally that you don't go according to some rule, or are you mostly making up your own rules? Now, again, if you're mostly making up your own rules, fine. So support, you know, create a new manual. But so in other words, I think the manual, putting it a bit absurdly, the good thing about writing down a few simple rules is you can see if you're breaking them. And so they have to be rules that you can recognize when you're breaking them or when you're doing them when you're not. And then the challenge is if you are breaking them, okay, come up with some better ones to describe the situation. So, and again, the whole anxiety about manuals, I think, is not what it seems to be. And I mean, I have been in meetings in, I think, in this country and in other countries, where psychoanalysts actually started clapping when somebody stood up and said, you can't do research in psychoanalysis in one way or another. And this just makes me almost want to cry, because it's based on not the meaning of research that anyone who's gone beyond first-year undergraduate. You know, there's a lot of first-year undergraduate philosophy about research, such as, you know, the observer affects the observed. Yes, it does. So what? Or, you know, it's hard to measure things, or if you, the things you measure, etc. But if we can get beyond the first-year undergraduate stuff, then we can actually realize that a scientific attitude really only means try to be more precise about what is happening and try to introduce some kind of test, like the example I just gave with the rules. You ask people, oh, why did you say that? Why do you think you said that? So the next thing you could say is, oh, well, I don't know why people said anything. And of course it's unconscious, so why should, you know. So we ran into this kind of problem with the CCM group. Some people thought we were trying to read people's unconscious, or other people said we should be. I said, no, we're just trying to look at the different ways people use the unconscious or the transference or whatever, and we're going to draw inferences. That's what research is about, drawing inferences, and we're going to look for evidence. And if we don't think if somebody says those inferences are not very good, fine. We've written it down, now we can change it. So it is, I think, very much about writing down. That's like a hypothesis, and then changing it. But these can become very fancy, these terms, and then people get frightened.